Greetings, this is Mpoki Thompson for The Citizen. I'm here today with Abebe Selassie, IMF Director in charge of Africa. We'll talk about the role that the International Monetary Fund is playing to mitigate the COVID-19 pandemic, the impact here in Tanzania globally, but also to see what other operations does the IMF undertake here in Tanzania, in East Africa, and also the wider Africa region. Mr. Abebe, welcome.
Thank you.
So how are you finding Tanzania so far?
It's unfortunately a brief visit, but always lovely to be here in Tanzania.
Okay, great. So we'll just get right to it. Unfortunately, right now the world is facing a global pandemic, COVID-19. It has devastated economies all around, and I'm quite sure even your visit here in Tanzania has involved most of that. How the IMF is helping Tanzania to mitigate, the adverse impacts of COVID-19. There's been this general concern, or rather anticipation, towards the $571 million that Tanzania applied in economic relief from the IMF to help the country overcome some of the impacts of COVID-19. We would like to know what's the status, when is the country expected to receive the money, or can you just give us a highlight on the progress of that loan application?
Thank you for the invitation and those questions. I mean, first and foremost, of course, this pandemic really has been a brutal economic shock that has disrupted the lives and livelihoods of our people and really threatens to reverse a lot of the development progress our countries have made over the last many years. So at the IMF, we've treated this as a major threat to the well-being of people and acted in that fashion. So in the immediate aftermath of the pandemic, we sought and got from our board the mandate to provide double the normal amount that we provide under emergency financing facilities. And this is a facility that has been used now by up to 80 countries to have the resources to spend more government spending to tackle directly this pandemic, because unless we put this behind us, we cannot rebuild our economies or think about the medium to long-term challenges our economies face. So we moved in that fashion. Not only on sub-Saharan Africa, we provided financing last year 13 times what we normally would in a given year. So that shows kind of how big a threat we've seen this and leaning forward. Now, turning to Tanzania, the government has requested this RCF request, the request for support under this rapid credit facility, and we are processing that as we speak. We're working very hard on it. What we wanted to see is a clear plan of how the resources would be used, so we could provide the resources, and that plan is, as you know, shaping up right now under the leadership of President Samia. And as soon as that plan is provided to us, we hope to process the request and present it to our executive board.
So what you're trying to say is that issuance of the loan right now pretty much lies on the government giving you...
So we have to make, the way it works is that, we have to have a credible case that we can make to our executive board for approval. Indeed. And we need to understand how the resources would be used and how they integrate into, other aspects of government economic policy, of course, and a little bit also how the pandemic is affecting the economy. Okay, so getting hold of that data and the like. So we're working very actively on that, and indeed, I'm here also to, meet President Samia, understand what the government's preferences are, what the strategy is. So that will also facilitate the discussions very significantly. Okay,
so I understand one of the preconditions before IMF actually issuing the loan was Tanzania being able to provide make public the data, COVID-19 data. I understand that's part of, not only from IMF, but wasn't that part of the conditions?
No, I think okay, so just to be very clear, I think before you solve this problem, you have to understand the extent of it, the magnitude of it, right? Yes, so I think there has been the government itself, first of all, it doesn't need for us from outside to come and say this, but I think the government in how they want to tackle the pandemic has been looking for ways in which that they can collect and make available data on the number of cases, where it's flaring, where it's receding, so you know whether your interventions are appropriate. But I think there's a need to scale that up as much as possible. I think, over the last year, what a lot of other countries have done, of course, is scale up the amount of testing that they're doing, going out and securing PPEs and the like. So we're encouraging that, interventions that the government is making be scientific and data-based. So that's a discussion that we've had. Okay. But it's not a condition, and I think it's ridiculous to consider it.
Okay, yeah, I understand. So what's your view, or what's your assessment of the current government's move to handle COVID-19? Because we've seen definitely a shift towards science-based reasoning, logical reasoning in regards to science. So what's your assessment of the government's shift, or how it's handling COVID-19 at the moment?
So, I think we really like the very deliberative and considered way in which President Samia and her administration have been approaching matters of economic policy, health policy when it comes to COVID. So, she had, I understand, created an independent advisory committee which has delivered on recommendations and on which the government is now deliberating and beginning to act on. So it's really very, very good and very encouraging progress.
Great. Now, you mentioned that some of your economic assistance to sub-Saharan African countries has surged 13 times, or double the amount that you used to provide. Now, East African countries, Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, Rwanda, they have massively borrowed during this COVID-19 pandemic, to sort of, like I said, mitigate the impacts of the pandemic. Now, do you think that this massive borrowing is sustainable?
Okay, so that's a very good question. And if you could allow me to say a little bit about what the specific role of the IMF in this context is.
Yes.
Now, the IMF, typically, the kind of financing we provide is when countries are either facing some kind of macroeconomic disequilibrium and needing some support at times like that, or emergency situations like the one that countries are facing in the context of the pandemic. So this is different from the regular market type borrowing that countries have been relying on. For example, Kenya, Rwanda to some degree have been borrowing by issuing Eurobonds in external markets, or bilaterally from other creditors. And what differentiates our financing is that it's comes with it's a highly concessional. It has 0.5% interest compared to domestic borrowing is 10-12% often. Borrowing on commercial terms can be 6, 7, 8%. So the financing we provide is also very concessional. The reason why countries have turned to us at the time like this is exactly because we are able to provide when markets are disrupted, when other sources of financing are strained. Countries can come and borrow from the IMF at relatively minimal cost. And as I said, through the rapid credit facility, it's not about having an economic program or reforms, but it really is to tie countries over to provide support for their people at emergency situations. So that's why countries have turned to us. Now, it's really important to distinguish between this rapid emergency type financing that we've been providing for the last year from other financing in the context of countries doing economic reforms and the like. And what Tanzania has asked for is this rapid credit financing, and that's what we've provided. Over the last year, we have provided such financing to the likes of Rwanda, Kenya, Uganda also. And again, if countries also, over and above that, also want to pursue reforms, have a reform agenda that they would like us to support, of course we can provide much cheaper financing than the alternative. One last point I want to make on the debt issue. I mean, the debt has been built up for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's because countries have been investing a lot in infrastructure, right? Where our countries have not been as effective, of course, is in collecting the rates of return on this infrastructure investment. So tax revenues have not kept pace, causing some strain, if you will, okay? Another factor why debt has gone up also, of course, is that, in the pursuit of development, the amount of governments have been spending probably has outpaced the amount of resources that they have. So striking a balance between development spending and debt issues is also really important. Where we come in is that, when countries want to strike this balance and, reduce fiscal deficits over time, we can offer you a cheaper way of doing that than the alternative. And of course, if you reduce the deficit down to zero overnight, you can imagine what kind of pain would be felt. So we are here to support this and bridge temporarily this kind of financing that countries need.
Great. So in a recent meeting with editors, the Tanzania Editors Forum, President Samia Suluhu Hassan said that her major priority right now is to rebuild the economy. So the government has taken different fiscal measures to try and ensure that the economy performs better in the current financial year, but also for the foreseeable future. She's targeting 5.6%. As the IMF, what advice would you give to the government that would help it be able to sort of move in the right path in as far as economic progress is concerned?
Okay, so in the immediate term, our managing director, Kristalina Georgieva, has been saying that vaccine policy is economic policy. Okay? Without getting this pandemic behind us, without that, it's really difficult to see how we can pursue economic development, the longer-term development agenda. Okay? You've seen just here to the north in Uganda what the government has had to do when a third wave struck. They've had to shut their economy. South Africa is having to do that also. So I think in the near term, focusing like a laser beam on getting the pandemic under control is really what's called for. And we're really, really pleased to see that that's exactly what President Samia is working on, her new administration is working on. And I think in her first 100 days, I understand her 100 days were yesterday or so.
Yes.
It's really very good to see that, all of the progress that her administration has made. Second, moving forward, the pandemic really has caused a lot of people to lose their livelihoods, right? So I think a particular emphasis on finding ways to reverse some of the increase in poverty that we've seen, some of the kids that have perhaps dropped out of school because schools have been closed, or when families are under strain, not all kids will be able to go to school and the like, the situation. So having targeted social protection programs, spending a bit more on health and education at a time like this, we think would also make a lot of sense. And then, of course, there's all of the need that the government is going to have to beef up the direct tackling of the pandemic. So these, I think, we see as areas of some, of some importance in the near term. I think the government is very much working in that direction. And of course, the kind of financing we're providing is exactly intended to help support those kind of initiatives.
Okay, great. So in 2019, the IMF issued a report that criticized the late Magufuli's regime in what was said to be unpredictable policies and statistics. Now, the report unfortunately weren't given the go-ahead to be published. It was blocked, so it really did not get to circulate as much as people would have expected in order to provide better context and understanding. Now, to the current government, what is your view of some of the reforms that President Samia Suluhu Hassan has undertaken? Just the IMF, how do you view some of these reforms, and in context to the previous regime?
So, frankly, we're not here to assess I'm not here, at least to assess how economic policy has been implemented, and it's really early yet. But I have to say that, the main threats that, Tanzania's people and economy face right now, in our view, is this pandemic, of course, and the fact that the President Samia's administration has really zeroed in to tackle that, I think is incredibly good news. And I think, we also like, as I said, the very constructive and deliberative way in which she's considering proposals, inputs, and taking a decision on the basis of independent advice that she's getting from her colleagues. So I think really, really very encouraged and pleased with the direction in which she wants to take the economy.
Okay, then on to that, what do you think is some of the assistance that the president needs in her endeavor to rebuild the country? What do you think is the major assistance that she requires?
Again, far be it from me or us from outside to weigh in on this. I think, really at the moment, of course, learning from the experience of other countries,
yes.
Who have been tackling this pandemic, some incredibly effectively, seeing what was done, and I think reaching out to peers in the region beyond to try and see what policies has worked and others. I think financing also can help facilitate that decision making, so we can provide that, and of course economic policy advice. But I think the international community also, and this is the point of a blog post that the Managing Director and I put out today, we are at a very, very dangerous moment in our region right now. This Delta mutation driven third wave that we've seen in neighboring countries really risks creating scenarios like the one that unfolded in India if we're not careful.
Yes.
So we're calling on the international community to prioritize sending vaccines up to the tune of $250 million, if not more, so that Africa is not left behind. Right now we see a dangerous divergence in terms of vaccine access.
Yes,
with per adult population, Africans, less than 1% of our sub-Saharan African per adult population has been vaccinated, compared to 30% or more in advanced countries. And this is just unfathomable, and it's something that the international community needs to help countries overcome.
Okay, I think on to that, there is an interesting sort of situation that's ongoing currently from the African context, but also globally, because we're seeing an imbalance in terms of access to COVID-19 vaccines, and there are worries that some countries that have even delayed to issue the go-ahead to receive the vaccine, such as Tanzania, will face a tougher period when the time comes when we actually roll out the vaccines. How does the IMF, when it comes now to the economic assistance that you provide, how do you weigh between the countries that actually, the poor countries that might need more resources, financial assistance from IMF compared to others, yet we're all facing one global pandemic?
So, in the nature of our work, we normally deal with macroeconomic type issues, but of course this pandemic has forced us to reckon with the wreckage that it could leave behind on economies unless addressed head on, which is why, as I explained earlier, we've done unimaginable things over the last year to support our countries. Beyond that, seeing a big need to make the case for investment in vaccines in particular, my colleagues have put out a bold and ambitious plan which outlines that, with spending of about 50 billion, much of which has already been allocated, that we could have extremely ambitious global targets where 40% of the global population would be vaccinated by end of the year and 60% by the middle of the year. Right now, that's not what's on the cards. And in particular, people in poorer countries, our region in particular, stand to be left behind. So we have laid out very bold proposals on, what needs to be done concretely to make sure that we hit this target. So coming to your question on countries like Tanzania, in the near term, unfortunately, all of the supply that's going to be produced over the next year really has already been locked up by countries that have already paid for it. Okay, so and scaling up that production capacity immediately will face challenges. So the immediate support that's needed is really for reallocation of the vaccines that many advanced countries have that are much more than they need, given now that they've made a lot of progress. Reallocation of that to COVAX, but importantly also to AVAT, the African Union Vaccine Access Initiative, is incredibly important. So we are calling on the immediate reallocation there. Beyond this also, financing is needed, for example, to get the plant in South Africa that could produce 300-400 million Johnson & Johnson vaccines. That could be an important supply to Havat and others. So making sure that financing goes to these initiatives to get vaccines to our people is going to be really important, and Tanzania also would stand to benefit now that it's applied to join the COVAX initiative, but also the Havat. So that really is what's needed.
Okay. Look, one of the things that you mentioned before IMF decides to actually give Tanzania the loan application for COVID-19, the $571 million, was you wanted an assurance that the money would be spent in actually helping deal with COVID-19. What are some of the measures or mechanisms that are in place to ensure that indeed that's what the money is going to be used for? Do you have any follow-up? How do you
First we ask for the plan, the government, the spending initiatives that the government is going to be pursuing. Ideally, of course, you want to see that incorporated in the budget, which is the national document on how the country's resources are allocated. If not, then you want that to be reflected in a credible and comprehensive document, which basically outlines how the resources will be used. Kristalina has been saying that spend the money wisely, but keep the receipts.
Yeah.
So it would be useful also and important that later there is national auditing processes are followed to make sure that the money has been spent where it was intended. Okay, so those are important steps, and of course we ask that beneficial owners of companies that are receiving awards, are made public. So there is public scrutiny. Again, showing exactly to the public, it's not just to the IMF, how the money is being used was also, I think, part of strengthening good governance in countries. No?
Okay. As I understand, the IMF has a lending capacity to a tune of $1 trillion. Now, how much of that has so far been spent, and is that for the COVID-19 period, or I just want to understand the context of the $1 trillion?
The $1 trillion is really our total capacity to lend in the if there were to be a big conflagration, a big crisis. My understanding is that we will verify the numbers for you, but overall commitments, including under all of the facilities that we have, because, as I said earlier, 80 countries have come for this rapid financing facility, but also many others who have other commitments. Up to about a quarter of our balance sheet is committed in some form or another.
Okay, indeed. Now, there's a subject which stirred quite a conversation here in Tanzania recently with regards to cryptocurrencies, when the president advised the central bank, the Bank of Tanzania, to prepare for the use of cryptocurrencies here in Tanzania in the near future. What is the IMF's advice to the government with regards to cryptocurrencies, considering that you deal with markets that are far advanced in as far as cryptocurrencies, usage of cryptocurrencies is concerned?
Okay, so I think the area of cryptocurrencies, central bank digital currencies, is a fast evolving area. Okay, and there's a lot of because we see all of this stuff on news in terms of the valuation of cryptocurrencies and the like. There is quite a lot of excitement as to see how effective a vehicle this would be for carrying out transactions in some of our countries, given the payment systems are not as strong as they could be and the like. So we understand why there is that curiosity and why countries are interested. So it's good to try and understand what's going on, what the debates are about, what use, if any, we could make of this technology. But in terms of cryptocurrencies specifically, whether they're ripe for use in a broad fashion for transacting, we think it's a bit premature to say that. Okay, it's premature. You've seen the volatility in the price of these things, so that kind of volatility is really not what you want to introduce in your economy, in your major model of payment. The security features are not clear, so there's a lot of complications that would suggest that this is not the type of technology or innovation that is ripe for use across the board in our economies. But keeping abreast of developments, particularly how central banks are thinking about the possible introduction of digital currencies and the like, I think is important, and is in keeping with the mandate, of course, of the BOT. And so it's important that they keep an eye on this, and the guidance that the president has given, I think, makes a lot of sense.
Okay, great. So would you say that the COVID-19 pandemic is the biggest disaster that the IMF has had to deal with? If not, what has been the biggest? And in terms of the plans that the IMF has, the development plans across different countries around the world, how has COVID-19 altered the plans that you had set?
That's a difficult question. I think it goes without saying that, this is probably the biggest economic, health of course, but the economic shock also that countries have faced in the last 100 years, right? So I think it's fair to say, yes, indeed, this is probably the biggest crisis that we've had to deal with. And what's worrisome is that, we're still in the middle of it, quite frankly. As I said, many of our countries are facing a third wave and are very worried that what we're seeing is dangerous divergence, not just in the economic trajectory countries face, but also the health trajectory. So, I don't want to give the impression that this thing is behind us. We're still in the middle of it, and as an institution trying to behave that way. Now, you asked for what our plan is for individual countries. I'm sorry to disappoint you, but we don't have plans for individual countries. Okay. We, of course, work with governments and serve as trusted advisors to governments, so they can bounce ideas of us, or if they have a plan, so we can support it. And of course, we give technical advice. We also have views